I am going to call the special board meeting of the Arizona Regents to order. And Kim, can you please confirm that we have a quorum? Perfect. So before we start, I would like to introduce our three new regents who are currently drinking from the fire hose. We have Regent Bob Herbold, who I think some of you have had the opportunity to meet this morning, before the meeting started.
Thank you.
We have Jessica Pacheco. And then we also have our new student regent from NAU, Regent Rachel Canyer. And I just want to thank you all for accepting this responsibility, and we are really looking forward to working with you. So this is a hybrid meeting. Only board members, board and university staff, and individuals involved with the presentations of an agenda item will be attending the meeting in person. Members of the public may attend the public portion of the hybrid meeting by viewing the live stream. And that is available on youtube.com at the Abor Live link. Today's public session is scheduled from 9 to 10:05. The board will convene an executive session after that for the items listed on the executive session agenda. At this point, I would like to ask Regent Shootman to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So President Crow, I want to thank you all for, you and your staff for hosting us today. I know it's complicated in this arena, but it is greatly appreciated.
What we do.
That's what we do.
Every day and every day.
So our first item on the agenda is the approval of the consent agenda. Items on the consent agenda include items 4 through 9. Does anybody have any conflicts to declare on any of those items? Seeing none, I move that the board approve items 4 through 9 as listed on the consent agenda. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you. We are going to quickly move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the election of a new board secretary. And Jenny Pollock is going to present this item.
Thank you, Regent Manson. Regent Manson and members of the board office is asking the board to elect Regent Mata to serve as the board secretary for this term, ending on June 30th, 2022, as discussed in the executive summary. As you may recall, last April, the board voted to elect Regent King to serve as secretary, and Regent King has since been appointed to the Supreme Court and obviously is no longer a regent and can't continue to serve. So the board office is asking that the board approve the election of Regent Cecilia Mata to serve as board secretary, again, ending with the term for secretary on June 30th, 2022, as discussed in the executive summary. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions? Last chance, Cecilia.
Maybe a speech?
Accept.
All righty, so I move that the board elect Cecilia Mata to serve as board secretary through June 30, 2022. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries, and thank you very much. All righty, the next item on the agenda is the presentation of the Abor annual report, and Executive Director John Arnold will be presenting that. John, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Regent Mata, for agreeing to serve in that role. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Chair, for indulging me on this. You'll note we had a number of annual reports in the consent agenda today. I asked that this report, our official annual report that we're required by statute to submit to the Governor's Office, Secretary of State, and the Legislature, be discussed in regular session, both so I could address all of the reports and thank Chad Sampson and his team and Sarah Harper and her team for preparing such excellent documents that we submit every year. And then specifically highlight this report that Sarah and her team worked so hard on to put together. Just a few highlights. This year, the theme of our annual report is A Promise to Arizona. The report is framed against the backdrop of the founding of our institutions of public higher education. Each of our public universities was conceived in this same promise that we carry forward today. This year's report details the vast enterprise accomplishments that are driving educational outcomes in the state forward. And just to highlight, I won't go through everything, but a short reel of highlights. Number one, we welcomed and celebrated the appointment of the 17th president of NAU, President Jose Luis Cruz Rivera, and we welcome him and celebrate that accomplishment. For the second consecutive year, there is no increase in undergraduate resident tuition at our 3 universities. The board continues to expand and promote the Arizona Teachers Academy, bringing more teachers into our classrooms. This last year, the board continued the development of updated enterprise-wide metrics, and despite the pandemic, we saw improvement in all of our major educational metrics this year. Speaking of COVID, the universities responded and helped guide and support our state through the pandemic and continue to do so. And again, despite the pandemic, we celebrated and held another successful Regents Cup and awarded winners. ASU continues to hold the cup. We'd like to see UA and NAU do something about that this year as we prepare for the cup. We launched the Arizona Innovation Alliance this year. In athletics, we had a terrific year with University of Arizona women's basketball team going to the championship. The Sun Devils earned 4 individual NCAA titles in track and field, and NAU's men's cross country team won its 4th national championship. And we saw a number of our athletes participate in the Olympics this year, which was exciting to see and celebrate. We saw expansions in research and continued to grow the research enterprise. So all in all, we had another great year despite the many difficulties that we faced. And I just want to thank Sarah and her team. They did a terrific job capturing that in this report this year. So with that, Madam Chair, I've asked the board to accept the report so that we can submit it to the state. Thank you.
Perfect. Are there any questions or comments from the board or from either of the presidents? The presidents are here. Seeing none, I do want to say we all know it was an extraordinarily difficult year, and I have to express some pride in the manner in which the universities have handled this and moved forward in a very difficult situation. We really appreciate your efforts in that arena. It has been nothing short of heroic. So with that, I am going to move that the board accept the Arizona Board of Regents Fiscal Year 2021 Annual Report. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you very much. Moving on, our next item is the discussion of the fiscal year 2023 state budget request. Lorenzo Martinez is going to provide an overview of the overall state budget request, and the presidents, CFOs, and Executive Director Arnold, I think, are planning to comment following Lorenzo's overview.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We just have a reference slide that shows the components of the fiscal year 2023 budget. I won't repeat anything that's in that 3-page summary in your materials, but I will make a couple of comments. As you may be aware, the enterprise budget totaled $6.3 billion. Of that, about 14% comes from state appropriations. This year, we received the largest increase we've received in quite a while, just under $156 million. And so this year's budget request builds on the components of what was funded this year. We have continuation and expansion of the New Economy Initiative. We do plan on all of these components of this budget request to come back to the board with more details in September the September board meeting. And just a couple of comments and some additional ones. For the Arizona Promise program, this year we received $7.5 million. We're requesting an additional amount to expand that program. We have approximately 37,000 Pell eligible resident students in our system, and this will help to support that initiative to have access to low-income students. For the Yuma Project, this is intended to align with the Arizona Innovation Alliance, which John referenced in the annual report. As you know, that's a tri-university initiative to also figure out ways to enroll more students. When it comes to Yuma, this request is intended to work. There's a big focus with NAU and Arizona Western College to provide programming for that area that will meet attainment and workforce needs. Some of the thoughts at this point with this funding is anticipated to create some student service space with this and also expand the programming there as well. And then the final component with capital of $50 million. Again, more detail to come in September, and the universities are identifying their higher priority items, and we will come back with a plan in September on the distribution for those amounts. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Do I have questions, comments? Regent Duvall?
I do. Thank you, Lorenzo or John, or the presidents. I'm curious if you could just put this into context as to what we're hearing by way of projections of state revenue and how the overall state budget looks, and in that context, how this will be perceived.
So, good question, Madam Chair, Regent Duvall. Yes, the state throughout the pandemic actually experienced pretty strong economic growth as far as revenues for the state. That continues to this day. The JLBC recently published their monthly report for July, and that was 144 million in that range above the forecast. And so at this point, all indications are that momentum, economic momentum and growth for the state will continue. So this should, at this point, this request should not, the state will have resources, I think, this coming year to allocate for initiatives.
What was the growth versus year ago of the total budget?
Sorry, Regent Herbal, could you speak into the microphone because we
Sure.
can't
What was
hear you.
what was the growth versus year ago versus, for the total budget?
I don't have that for the enterprise. I don't have that off the top of my head, but it was in a fairly similar range. And the thing about it is we saw some growth in tuition and revenue. Again, most of that as resident tuition stayed flat, but a lot of that growth was for enrollment, came from enrollment growth. The state, again, 156 million. That increased the state portion from approximately 12% of our enterprise budget to 14% this year. So, and then gifts, grants, and contracts is the third major funding source, and that also saw some growth for our universities in the prior year. But I can get you the annual growth.
Thanks.
Regent Penley?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just for our new regions, I think an important part that underlies what Lorenzo was saying about the growth in our state allocation really deals with the fact that we've really altered the approach that we've taken as a board in really addressing what we need from the state to really advance Arizona. At an earlier period, we were focusing on the substantial low funding and really arguing that the state should support in-state Arizona students up to the cost of those. That had proved not very successful, despite what most of us thought was quite rational, and that is support your Arizonans so that they can go to school. So we took a very different approach. We called it a new economy initiative, But what we focused on was the real transformation that we're seeing in this economy and the competitive nature of that economy, especially when you look at state, cities like Salt Lake City, Austin, Texas, a whole set of places that are much more driven by high technology and a lot of new industry that's developing at this stage. So what we said to the state is we can do more to assist Arizona in this transformational process if you support these initiatives that are driven by the three universities in selective areas. And we will expand those areas and increase the competitiveness of Arizona. That we believe, and I don't know, anybody else at the table could correct this, we believe resulted in much greater support from our governor and from legislators than the approach that we had taken previously.
I think that's completely accurate. I think, the fundamental change in the approach was more towards what can the universities do for the state as opposed to what can the state do for the universities. And, we have a tremendous engine with these three state universities to drive, and diversify Arizona's economy to the benefit of, the entire population. And so I think that approach was, and Larry is much, the architect of that. So I want to give credit where credit is due. But I think it was tremendously well received. And so I think it's a good approach for us to continue. A couple of things that I wanted to note, unless there are other comments or questions. Regent Ridenauer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you explain a little bit more about the capital needs? Why 50 million? Why not 100 million? What are, I'm sure, the figure could be much higher. Is there a reason for the 50 million? Is it a particular project or projects?
Madam Chair, Regent Ridenauer, no, it's, we thought it was a reasonable figure. The needs are great, as you point out, for sure. It's more a question of when you look at all of these components, what is your total request going to be? And, at what point are you asking for too much? What seems like a reasonable amount? Are we asking too little? And so 50 million, we figured was just a good start.
Is that divided among the three universities, or is it a particular project of any university?
We've started discussions with the universities on what the allocation methodology should be. In the past, we've had, if it was, for example, directed at building renewal, there's a formula for that, and we have historically distributed based on the proportion of each university. This isn't necessarily for building renewal projects. There may be other projects considered besides building rehabilitation and those sorts of things. So we'll have a discussion and work out an allocation plan to present.
And how does this tie into our bonding authority? Is there a reason we couldn't cover the 50 million in some kind of a bonding authority? Or is there a limit on our bonding authority?
Yes, there's a statutory and board policy limit that says no more than 8% of university expenditures can go to debt service for outstanding debt. For the most part, the universities are comfortably below that 8% limit. And historically, well, I shouldn't say historically, years past, over a decade or maybe 2 decades now, the system relied quite heavily on the state for building renewal funding. Last 2 decades, there's been very limited to no funding for building renewal. And so beginning in the 90s, the universities had begun to use some of their bonding capacity to deal with capital needs at the campuses.
Thank you.
President Crow?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to sort of contextualize this and not speaking for my fellow presidents, this state budget request is probably misnomered. I mean, it certainly is a request for funding or investment from the state. Just using the ASU example financially, in this fiscal year for which this request is being made, we will have to generate to attain the goals identified by the regents approaching $4 billion of other resources. So when we say that we are going to be really excited about $34.5 million of special investment from the state, we are very excited about that, but it's a specialty investment. So the state of Arizona has decided over the last 15 years to take a different approach than other states. We have adapted to that decision, and that decision is that they're no longer a principal financer of public higher education, full stop. They are an investor in public higher education and not yet an investor in students going to public higher education. That's something that's still on the agenda. So for new regents, it's worth noting that for 50 years, the people of Arizona invested $15 per $1,000 of income, personal income, in higher education. 1.5% of their personal income went to higher education. That's now less than $3. So a 5-fold reduction in the last 15 years as an investment strategy. I'm not questioning the investment strategy, I'm just saying what it is. That puts us per capita at the 49th lowest investment in higher education on a per capita basis. Wyoming is the highest, New Hampshire is 50th, and we're 49th. And so within that model, it's really important to look upon this as comprehensive about nothing. This is not reflective of anything other than the decision that has been made by this board to seek investments, as Regent Penley suggested, from the state for special initiatives. So the New Economy Initiative, and for financial aid for students, and that's where we are, financial aid and specialty initiatives. A $50 million one-time, as Lorenzo has suggested, capital investment. Morgan, we have $1 billion of projects in motion at ASU right now, capital-wise. And so, okay, and so it would be nice to get a little specialty investment from the state. It's not critical to the success of our projects in the sense that it makes a difference between doing and not doing. It just makes the state an investor in some of these things. I will say one thing relative to the notion of, and I've been in this position for 19 years, we've never had any investment from the state for capital improvement of any significance in terms of building renewal, I mean, ever.
This is a contentious issue at University of Washington also. What's your percentage of your total budget, Michael?
So our percentage of investment from the state is substantially lower than the enterprise investment. So we're in the 8.5, 8.4%. Wow. And that's without a medical school. So that would place us in the lowest 10, lowest 5 of major universities in the country.
University of Washington complains, and they're at like 27%.
Yeah. Well, and so we're not complaining. I mean, we have adjusted, we have adapted. And what we're trying to do, and this will be my last comment, what we're trying to do is make the case for substantial specialty investments where the state has a need, and then investments in the students so that they can attend the university. And we haven't gotten there yet. We're still working our way there. We know the people support these investments. The legislature does not yet support these investments.
I'm complaining.
So I mean, there's a couple of things that I'd like to touch on here specifically, and part of this is to help the new regents get a little bit of grasp of perhaps a little bit of the background. So starting specifically with the capital funding and the building renewal, there is actually a statutory calculation on an annual basis that is supposed to be funded to the universities for building renewal. That has not been funded. They have chosen to take that off the plate for at least the last 15 years. So if you were to accumulate the funding that we were supposed to have received over that period in time, while it's not on the state's balance sheet, there is legitimately a contingent liability of, probably over $1 billion that would have been paid to the universities for building renewal had those funds been allocated.
We're opening our bank accounts now.
So that's it's an interesting side. The government the legislature did have a statutory implementation at one point. It no longer provides those funds, and they have the ability and the right to do that on an annual basis. So the $50 million is a small investment in probably the most needy projects that we have at the universities that are short-term, and they prevent us from having to pay interest and borrow under our borrowing capacity. The Promise Program, Arizona is one of the only states that has not had a state-sponsored resident scholarship program. The Promise Program was first funded this year to $7.5 million, and we are incredibly appreciative for that and for the initiation of this project and this conversation. Lorenzo, I believe you mentioned that we have 37,000 Pell eligible students, resident students at this point. Is that resident students or is that population?
Madam Chair, resident Pell eligible students.
Resident Pell eligible students. So if you
From
take
Arizona.
$7.5 million and divide it by 37,000, that doesn't come anywhere near full tuition. That 7.5 was provided as ongoing funding. I have the understanding that this 25 that we are asking for in addition is also asking as ongoing funding. So that would take us to $32.5 million if we were to receive the whole thing. That then, is approximately, if I do rough math, $1,000 per student. Again, nowhere near the full tuition that we are sponsoring those students for. So there's a lot of room for expansion just based on the current numbers of Arizona Pell eligible students. President Crow?
Just want to add a contextual thing, just a data point if I might, and that is that right now with all the energy that we have, and I'm speaking only of the numbers for Arizona State University, we will spend $600 million of our own resources on financial aid this year. That's the largest number of any university in the country by a long shot. That is a very significant challenge for the institution to continue that, because in a sense that is a method of taxation on just the students that are coming to the university to pay for those students that can't attend the university. And to Regent Herbold's question, our revenue increase last year, even with our COVID losses, was about 7%, specifically at ASU.
Impressive, yeah.
And then the final point that I wanted to make is regarding the Yuma Project. And that, I believe, is going to be a joint ask between Abor and Arizona Western to expand projects and to provide student services, which they, Arizona Western, fully admits that they could use additional help in that arena. And, our universities are exceptionally good at student services. So that's a great marriage, I think, and a great opportunity for us to, push attainment in the Yuma County area. So.
I've got a question.
Yes, Regent Herbold.
Who makes the case to the state that they need more money? Other boards of trustees I've been on, they make the case to the state where you're not going deep enough with us, Here's what we could do if we could, get this kind of funding. And who's the aggressor? Who's the proponent of getting more money? Is it this group? And do we do that?
Say somebody.
Regent Pacheco.
Welcome to the board, Regent Pacheco. John, would you like to address that?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. Regent Herbold, yes, one of the key roles of the board is to advocate with the state and the governor's office on the needs of the universities, to explain those needs, and in some ways go past the governor and the legislature and explain the needs and the benefits of investment in the universities to the general public. We have struggled with that over the last few years, especially with the Republican Party, but even with the minority party as well, helping them recognize the benefits of investing in higher education. We've had greater success with the business community, and I think there is a broad and deep support among the business community, and a great recognition of the fire that we're playing with by underfunding our university system, and the long-term economic damage that we're doing to the state by systematically divesting in our universities. As we've noted, we had a little bit of success this year, and while we celebrate that, I don't think that was all due to goodwill towards the university system. And I was going to ask Lorenzo to address this, but I'll just bring it up. Last year, the federal government passed a maintenance of effort requirement for higher education in the state. And that federal maintenance of effort requirement did more to drive the appropriation of the universities than any argument we made. We did have some success in directing dollars to specific projects, but at the end, the appropriation we received was to the dollar, the maintenance of effort requirement. That requirement, as I understand it, continues for next year. And so we'll have another opportunity, because it should grow with the state budget, to go in and add dollars again to the university system. And so we want to make sure we are directing those MOE dollars to where we want them to be. But it has been a difficult dialogue in the state for the last really 2 decades, and will continue to be. And we're taking several steps to try to couch and explain the necessity of higher education and the benefits of higher education in political terms, in economic terms, and in individual family terms, so that we can raise broader awareness of what we're trying to do. I hope that was helpful. I think Regent Schutman.
Regent Schutman.
Well, thank you. Excellent description, John. I would just say that just because it's hard doesn't mean we don't have the obligation to continue to pursue and do that vigorously. And we have, and when we talk some more offline, we'll explore some of those ideas. The truth is, we have to find the message and the argument to persuade them to act. And to Regent Penley's great credit, his approach this last year saw some movement in our direction. And the establishment of the Promise program, while it's small, we now have a vehicle in place that can accept future funding. So I think it's important for us to stay positive and accept the responsibility that's on our shoulders to convince the legislature and the governor to step forward and provide additional funding, because it's in the best interest of the people of Arizona.
I agree. Thank you, Regent Penley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of our challenges, I think, and you see it in the lines that are in this particular slide that Lorenzo has presented, is that we're treating the New Economy Initiative as separate from the Arizona Promise Scholarship, when in fact these are ultimately integrated. We don't achieve a competitive position as a state unless we alter the high school graduation rate and the college going rate. And that's why the Arizona Promise Scholarship is essential to this transforming economy. Yes, if you give us more money, state of Arizona, we can do more in turning out the kind of engineers and health-related individuals who will really drive this state forward in terms of a labor force. But we don't get that labor force unless we alter the high school graduation rate and the college going rate, which are enormously low at this point relative to competitive states. So these issues, the New Economy Initiative, that is what we can do in creation of qualified labor for these transformational businesses, is driven indeed by whether in fact Arizonans have access to a college education and desire to graduate from high school, because they can say to their parents, and the parents can say to the child, we don't have to worry about whether we have the money to send you to school. And families don't have that money in so many cases. And those kids are going to drag us down as an economy until we figure out how to encourage them and fund them to go to our universities. That's why the Arizona Promise Scholarship is not separate from the New Economy Initiative. It is integral, part and parcel of what we're trying to do as a board.
It's the fuel.
Exactly.
It's the fuel for where we need to be. Do we have additional comments or questions?
Madam Chair,
Lorenzo?
if I may, just a bit more on that new economy initiatives. What we did do last year is we hired a well-known and well-respected consulting firm to do an analysis of the projects that were intended with that funding at the 3 universities. And part of what that analysis showed was the return on investment to the state based on that funding would come back and start turning positive for, as I recall, for ASU and U of A at around year 6. And then depending on how you calculate it, the return comes back in starting in year 6. And if you exclude some things and only apply it to direct things, you know, you could say it doesn't happen until year 12 or 15. It was a bit longer for NAU, but I do think that also contributed to part of the support we experienced in this last year. And then one final thing to Regent Herbal's question. Last year, the enterprise budget was $5.5 billion. This year, it's at $6.3 billion, so that's an $800 million increase. The one thing I would note there is of that $800 million, almost $400 million of that is from the federal stimulus funding that came into the universities. And again, we received $156 million from the state. So roughly a little over $200 million was from other university resources.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Regent Duval.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This conversation obviously taps a vein in me. I get passionate about it, but a couple of just facts to put this into an additional perspective. Number one, the high water mark of state funding for higher education was 1983. It has had a couple of small bumps since then, but essentially a downward curve, not for a decade or two, but for 4. Secondly, the amount of institutional financial aid now exceeds the amount of state investment. That is a fact which is true for only a couple of states, and the relationship between our institutional financial aid and our state support is the most unfair rule in the United States. Third, 33 states have a promise program. 62 cities have a promise program. It's time that we do. And fourth, most importantly to support that, we have among the lowest attainment rates in the United States. We can't get to the 21st century economy with the lowest attainment rates in the United States, and we can't increase attainment unless we increase access, and we can't increase access without a promise program.
Pretty clear there. All righty, are there any additional comments or questions? All right, seeing none, I am going to move that the board approve the fiscal year 2023 state budget request of the universities and board office as described in the executive summary. The approved requests will be forwarded to the governor by September 1st. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you very much. So I have 20 minutes to spare. We are going to take a quick break and then we will move into executive session. I do need a motion. I'm going to make a motion prior to taking a recess to enter into executive session for the items on the executive session agenda. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? The board will now convene in executive session, and we will move to the alumni room for this executive session. Please bring all of your items with you. We will not be returning to this room. Thank you. See you in a few minutes.